The train rattled south through Tennessee in the autumn of 1945, carrying men who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny and now returned to a land that had never stopped fighting them. Sergeant James Richter sat by a smudged window, his uniform still crisp despite 3 days of travel, watching the landscape shift from industrial gray to rural green. He had survived the Ardennes. He had walked through villages the Germans had abandoned, seen what hatred could build and what it could destroy. Now, as the train slowed approaching the colored waiting room in Clarksville, he felt his chest tighten with a familiar dread that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The platform was segregated, as he knew it would be. White passengers disembarked on the near side where a covered waiting area offered shade and benches. Colored passengers walked farther down to a smaller shelter with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it leaked. Richter stepped off the train carrying a single duffel bag and stood for a moment in the October sun, letting his eyes adjust. 3 years away. 3 years of believing that somehow, something might have changed. The weight of his bronze star felt suddenly foolish in his breast pocket. A medal for valor that meant nothing here. In the country he had bled for. He was not alone. Over the next several weeks, other men returned to Clarksville and the surrounding county. Corporal Marcus Webb, who had driven supply trucks through France. Private First Class Elijah Kane, who still flinched at car backfires and woke most nights drenched in sweat. Sergeant Thomas Pruitt, older than the others, a quartermaster who had kept his unit fed through the winter of 1944. They came back to shotgun houses and tenant farms, to mothers who wept and held them, to children who barely remembered their faces. They came back to a South that had not moved, had not softened, had only hardened in their absence like sun-baked clay. The town itself was typical of the region, a courthouse square surrounded by brick storefronts, a Confederate monument in the center, streets that turned to red dirt once you left the white neighborhoods. The colored section sprawled east of the railroad tracks, a collection of wood frame houses, small churches, and a single general store owned by an elderly man named Hosea Green who extended credit when times were hard. The white section had paved streets and electric lights on every corner. The colored section had neither, and the boundary between them was understood absolutely. Enforced not by signs, but by generations of violence and the certain knowledge of what happened when lines were crossed. Richter found work at a lumber mill, the same place he had worked before the war. The foreman looked at his uniform and said nothing, pointed to the loading dock where colored workers hauled cut timber 12 hours a day. The pay was less than what white workers received for easier tasks. When Richter mentioned this, the foreman spat tobacco juice near his boot and told him he was lucky to have work at all, that plenty of boys hadn't come home, and maybe he should remember that before getting uppity. Richter swallowed his words, clenched his jaw, and lifted the timber. But something had shifted in him across the ocean. He had learned to follow orders, yes, but he had also learned what men could do when they worked together with discipline and purpose. He had learned what happened when you let tyranny go unchallenged. The first cross burned in November, just after Thanksgiving. A sharecropper named Daniel Moss had tried to register to vote at the courthouse. He had walked up the steps in broad daylight, had stated his intention to the clerk, had answered the literacy test questions correctly, despite their deliberate obscurity. The clerk had looked at him with flat eyes and told him to come back next week. That night, 15 men in white hoods rode out to Moss's farm. They planted the cross in his front yard, soaked it in kerosene, and lit it while his wife screamed and his children watched from behind curtains. The cross blazed against the November sky, casting shadows that danced like demons. The men sat on their horses and watched it burn, then fired shotguns into the air before riding away. No one called the sheriff. Everyone knew the sheriff had been there, knew his voice even behind the hood. Richter heard about it the next morning at the mill. The story spread quickly through the colored section, whispered on porches and in church pews. Daniel Moss had packed his family and left that same night, headed north to Memphis or Chicago or anywhere that wasn't here. His cotton still stood unharvested in the field. The house sat empty, a warning to anyone else who might get ideas about voting or rights or changing the way things had always been. Richter said nothing, but his hands shook slightly as he loaded timber that day. And that night he cleaned his service rifle for the first time since coming home. He did it slowly, methodically, the way the army had taught him, and when Marcus Webb stopped by and saw what he was doing, Webb nodded and went home to clean his own weapon. December brought cold rains and a deepening tension. The Klan had been quiet during the war years, diminished and scattered, but now it was reorganizing. Men who had stayed home while others fought were reclaiming power through violence, asserting dominance through terror. They rode at night in trucks with the headlights off, circling colored neighborhoods, letting their presence be known. Sometimes they fired guns in the air. Sometimes they dragged men from their homes and beat them bloody in the road. The local sheriff, a thick-necked man named Cahill, who wore his badge like a crown, made no arrests. When colored citizens came to report incidents, he told them to stop causing trouble, that they were probably mistaken about what they had seen, that good Christian white men wouldn't do such things without provocation. On a Wednesday evening in mid-December, Elijah Kane was walking home from his job at the Cotton Gin when a truck slowed beside him. 3 white men leaned out, their faces flushed with whiskey and malice. They called him boy, asked him if he forgot how to act while he was away. Kane kept walking, kept his eyes forward, his heart hammering. One of the men jumped from the truck bed and shoved him. Kane stumbled, caught himself, and for a split second considered fighting back. He had killed men in Europe. He knew how to hurt them, how to make them stop. But he also knew what happened to colored men who struck white men, knew that a mob would come and he would hang from a tree by morning. So he kept walking, absorbing their laughter, their shouts, their contempt. When he finally reached home, he sat on his porch steps and shook, not from fear but from rage that had nowhere to go except inward, corroding. That night, Thomas Pruitt called a meeting. He did it quietly, word passed from house to house, veteran to veteran. They gathered in the back room of Hosea Green's store after midnight. 8 men who had worn the uniform and carried the weapons of the United States Army. They sat on crates and barrels, smoking cigarettes in the darkness, their faces barely visible in the glow of a single kerosene lamp. Pruitt spoke first. He was 41, graying at the temples, a man who had survived one war and had no intention of being terrorized in peace. He said they had fought overseas for freedom, for dignity, for principles that were supposed to mean something. He said they had learned skills in the military, had learned discipline and tactics and how to defend positions. He said the Klan was organized, yes, but they were not soldiers. They relied on fear, on surprise, on the certainty that colored people would not fight back. What if that certainty was broken? What if the next time the Klan rode they met resistance? Not reckless resistance, not suicide, but organized defense. What if they protected their own the way they had protected their country? The room was silent. They understood what he was suggesting. They understood the risk. But they also understood that doing nothing meant watching their community be terrorized, meant watching children grow up in fear, meant accepting that their service had meant nothing, that the medals in their dresser drawers were just metal, that the oath they had taken to defend the Constitution applied only overseas, not here, not to them. James Richter spoke next. He said they needed rules. They needed discipline. If they were going to do this, they had to do it right, had to do it smart. No vigilante justice, no revenge, only defense. They would organize patrols, quiet ones, men stationed at the edges of the colored section to watch for approaching vehicles. They would establish communication, a system of signals. They would arm themselves, but would only engage if their community was directly threatened. They would document everything, keep records, so that if the law ever cared about justice, they would have evidence. Most importantly, they would tell no one outside this room. Not wives, not children, not friends. Loose talk could get them all killed. Marcus Webb outlined the logistics. They would rotate shifts, 2 men per night on opposite ends of the neighborhood. They would use hand signals learned in the service, avoid speaking when possible. They would cache weapons at strategic points, hidden but accessible. They would drill, practice their coordination, make sure that if the moment came, they would not fumble or freeze. Elijah Kane, despite his nightmares, despite the way his hands sometimes shook, volunteered to take the first watch. He said he slept badly anyway, might as well put the insomnia to use. They shook hands before leaving, a solemn ritual. They were not seeking violence. They had seen enough violence for 10 lifetimes. But they would not be victims. Not anymore. Not after everything they had survived. January 1946 arrived with frost and a brittle stillness. The patrols began, quiet shadows moving through the colored section after dark. Most nights were uneventful. The men stood in the cold, breath misting, listening to dogs bark and distant train whistles. They saw nothing unusual, just the normal rhythms of a poor community trying to survive. But their presence brought a subtle change. People noticed that the streets felt safer, that the random violence seemed to diminish slightly. The Klan still rode occasionally, still burned crosses, but always on the outskirts now, never deep into the colored section where they might encounter something unexpected. Sheriff Cahill heard rumors. He always heard rumors. In February, he drove slowly through the colored section in his patrol car, making his presence known, letting people see his badge and his shotgun. He stopped at Hosea Green's store, where old men sat on the porch despite the cold. He asked if there had been any trouble, any agitators, any outside influences stirring things up. The old men shook their heads, said everything was peaceful, said they just wanted to live their lives. Cahill stared at them, trying to read deception, then drove away. He knew something had changed, could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm. But he could not quite name it, could not quite grasp what these colored veterans were doing in the shadows. In March, the Klan planned something larger. Word reached the colored community through a maid who worked in the home of a Klan member. She overheard conversations, heard plans for a major demonstration, a show of force to remind the colored population who held power. They were planning a motorcade through the colored section, dozens of cars, armed men, a parade of intimidation that would end with a mass rally and cross-burning at the old Baptist church. The date was set for a Saturday night, when families would be home, when the terror would be most visible and most effective. The veterans met again, this time with greater urgency. Pruitt spread a hand-drawn map on the table, marking streets and intersections. He outlined the likely route the Klan would take, the narrow roads that formed natural choke points. Richter argued for positioning, for using the terrain the way infantry would. Webb suggested a warning system, a way to evacuate women and children before any confrontation. Kane, surprisingly calm, talked about fire discipline, about not shooting first but being ready to respond. They debated for hours, voices low and tense, weighing risks against necessity. Finally, they agreed on a plan. They would position men along the route at 3 key intersections. They would be visible but not aggressive, standing on porches and street corners, rifles held loosely but unmistakably present. The goal was deterrence, not engagement. If the Klan saw armed men ready to defend their homes, maybe they would reconsider. Maybe they would drive through and leave. Maybe the show of force would be enough to prevent violence rather than provoke it. It was a gamble, but doing nothing was also a gamble, one they had already lost too many times. The Saturday arrived cold and clear. The colored section seemed to hold its breath. Women and children were quietly moved to the church basement, the safest structure in the neighborhood with thick walls and few windows. The veterans took their positions as dusk fell, 12 men spread across 3 blocks, each with a rifle and a handful of ammunition. They wore their service jackets, a deliberate choice, a statement that they were not criminals or thugs, but soldiers who had earned the right to defend their homes. They waited in the gathering darkness, hearts pounding, mouths dry, trying not to think about what they were risking. What could go wrong? What might happen to their families if this went badly? The Klan arrived just after 8, a convoy of trucks and cars crawling down the main road into the colored section. Headlights off, engines rumbling, 40 or 50 vehicles carrying hooded men. They had expected fear, expected empty streets and curtained windows. Instead, they found James Richter standing in the middle of the road, rifle across his chest, his bronze star pinned deliberately to his jacket. Behind him on either side, other veterans stood in doorways and on porches, weapons ready, faces impassive. The lead truck stopped 20 yards away. For a long moment, nothing happened. The night was perfectly still, except for the idling engines and the pounding of too many hearts. Someone in the truck shouted for the colored men to get out of the road, to go back inside where they belonged. Richter did not move. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a non-commissioned officer who had commanded men under fire. He said this was their neighborhood, their community, and they were not going anywhere. He said they had fought for this country and had earned the right to live in peace. He said the convoy could turn around and leave, or things would get ugly for everyone involved. A Klan member fired a shot into the air, a warning, an attempt to reassert dominance through violence. But something unexpected happened. The veterans did not scatter, they did not run. Instead, they dropped into defensive positions. Rifles raised, covering the convoy from multiple angles with interlocking fields of fire exactly as they had trained. Marcus Webb's voice rang out from a side street, calm and clear, announcing that any hostile action would be met with force. Elijah Kane, positioned on a rooftop, chambered a round loudly enough to be heard in the quiet. The Klan had never encountered this. They were accustomed to victims, to people who cowered and fled. They were not prepared for military tactics, for coordinated defense, for men who had seen actual combat and were not intimidated by sheets and burning crosses. The lead truck's engine revved, uncertainty rippling through the convoy. Another shot was fired, this time toward a house, and immediately 3 return shots rang out, not aimed at people but at the truck's tires and radiator. The truck lurched, hissing steam, disabled. Chaos erupted. Some Klan members tried to advance on foot but found themselves pinned down by covering fire. Others tried to maneuver their vehicles, but the narrow streets and strategic positioning of the veterans made it nearly impossible. No one was killed in those first frantic minutes, but several Klan members were wounded. Shots that hit shoulders and legs, deliberate and controlled. The veterans held their fire discipline, shooting only when necessary, avoiding escalation while maintaining defense. Sheriff Cahill arrived 15 minutes later with deputies, sirens wailing, lights flashing. He expected to find colored people terrorized or dead, expected to restore order in the usual way. Instead, he found a disabled Klan convoy, wounded white men, and armed black veterans who had not fled or begged for mercy, but had defended their homes with military precision. His face flushed red, a vein throbbing in his temple. He shouted at the veterans to drop their weapons, to surrender, to stop resisting lawful authority. But Richter, still standing in the road, asked what law the Klan was upholding by invading their neighborhood with guns. He asked why the sheriff was demanding they disarm but not the Klan. He asked if the Constitution applied to everyone or just to some. The standoff could have ended in massacre. Cahill's hand rested on his service revolver. His deputies had shotguns raised. The Klan members who could still move were regrouping, shouting for reinforcements. But Thomas Pruitt, the oldest veteran, stepped forward with his hands raised but not in surrender, in a gesture of negotiation. He spoke directly to Cahill, his voice measured and calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He said no one wanted more bloodshed. He said the veterans would stand down if the Klan left immediately and did not return. He said they were not seeking trouble, only defending their homes, which was their right under any interpretation of the law. He said that if arrests were to be made, they should be made on both sides, equal justice for equal actions. Cahill stared at him, jaw working. He was trapped in a situation that exposed the hypocrisy of his entire system. If he arrested the black veterans, he would have to acknowledge why they had taken up arms, which meant acknowledging the Klan's terrorism. If he did nothing, he would lose face with the white community that kept him in power. The impasse stretched, tension coiling tighter until finally Cahill spat on the ground and ordered everyone to disperse. He told the Klan to take their wounded and leave. He told the veterans to get off the streets and stay in their houses. His voice shook with rage he could not fully express, with humiliation that would fester. The Klan convoy withdrew slowly, damaged trucks limping away, wounded men clutching bloody shoulders. The veterans watched them go, rifles still ready until the last vehicle disappeared. Then slowly they lowered their weapons and looked at each other. They had done something unprecedented. They had faced down the Klan and lived. They had defended their community and won, at least for tonight. But they also knew this was not over, that there would be consequences, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The next days were surreal. The white community seethed with outrage. Rumors spread, exaggerated and distorted, about colored veterans ambushing peaceful white citizens, about an armed insurrection, about outside agitators bringing northern ideas of racial equality. The local newspaper, owned by a man whose grandfather had been a Confederate officer, published editorials about maintaining order and respecting tradition. But the newspaper said nothing about the Klan convoy, nothing about the attempted intimidation, nothing about why black men had felt the need to arm themselves. Federal authorities arrived within a week. The FBI sent 2 agents to investigate, a formality required because soldiers were involved and weapons had been discharged. They interviewed Cahill, who painted the veterans as troublemakers. They interviewed Klan members who claimed they had been peacefully demonstrating when attacked without provocation. But they also interviewed the veterans, who told the truth calmly and without embellishment, who showed the records they had kept. The documentation of Klan activity, the pattern of terrorism that had been ignored for decades. The agents listened, wrote notes, and said little. They were professional and correct, but revealed nothing about what conclusions they might draw. James Richter was arrested 3 weeks later on fabricated charges of inciting a riot. Marcus Webb and Elijah Kane were arrested the same day on weapons violations that would never have been applied to white men. The arrests were theatrical, designed to reassert dominance, to remind the colored community who controlled the law. The veterans were held in the county jail, where deputies made sure they understood their vulnerability, where they were denied visitors and given minimal food. Thomas Pruitt, who had not been arrested, immediately organized legal defense, pooling money from the community, reaching out to the NAACP, writing letters to newspapers in Memphis and Atlanta and Chicago, telling the story that the local white press refused to tell. The trial was a foregone conclusion. The judge was a man who had never ruled in favor of a colored defendant. The jury was all white, all male, all members of a community that saw the veterans not as heroes but as threats. The prosecutor painted them as criminals who had learned violence in the army and brought it home to terrorize decent people. The defense attorney, a young white lawyer from Memphis who had volunteered through the NAACP, argued self-defense, argued constitutional rights, argued that these men had served their country and deserved the protections they had fought for. The jury deliberated less than an hour, guilty on all counts, sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years in the state penitentiary. The judge delivering the verdict spoke about maintaining order, about respecting the way of life in the South, about how service in the military did not give men the right to break the law. He looked directly at Richter when he spoke, his eyes cold and certain, and Richter looked back without flinching, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the despair flooding through him. But something had changed that could not be unchanged. The story, despite the local newspaper's silence, had spread. The black press picked it up, published accounts in papers throughout the country. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News all ran articles about black veterans in a small Tennessee town who had stood up to the Klan and were being punished for it. The NAACP filed appeals. Civil rights organizations sent money. Letters poured into the governor's office from across the nation, some supporting the veterans, others demanding harsher punishment. The country as divided as it had always been on matters of race. In the colored section of Clarksville, something else changed too. The patrols continued quietly, other veterans taking over from the imprisoned men. The Klan tried to riot again in June, but found the same armed resistance, the same coordinated defense, and retreated without engaging. Sheriff Cahill, frustrated and impotent, increased patrols in the colored section, but made no arrests, because the veterans broke no laws simply by standing guard over their own community. The unspoken truce held, tensions remained high, but the random violence diminished. The Klan had learned that terror only worked against the defenseless. Richter served 18 months before his conviction was overturned on appeal. Webb and Kane were released after 2 years. They returned to Clarksville, thinner and harder, marked by the experience but unbroken. The community welcomed them back with a quiet celebration at the Baptist church. No speeches or fanfare, just the presence of people who understood what they had sacrificed. Thomas Pruitt, now old and tired, embraced each of them in turn, his eyes wet with tears he did not try to hide. The veterans resumed their lives as best they could. Richter went back to the lumber mill where the foreman said nothing but gave him slightly better shifts. Webb found work as a mechanic using skills learned in the Army. Kane struggled with nightmares that never fully went away, but found some peace working at his uncle's farm where the rhythms of planting and harvest gave structure to his days. They met occasionally, less formally now, sitting on porches and talking about small things, weather and work and family. They rarely spoke about that night in March 1946, but it lived in them, a shared knowledge that they had done something that mattered, that they had refused to be victims, that they had defended their community when no one else would. The broader struggle continued, of course. The South did not transform overnight. Segregation persisted, enforced by law and custom and violence. The Klan remained active in the region, though more cautious now about where and when it operated. Sheriff Cahill kept his badge until he died of a heart attack in 1952, never held accountable for his complicity in terrorism. The justice system remained unjust, the social order remained oppressive, the mountain to climb remained steep and brutal. But something had shifted in that moment when armed black veterans stood in the road and said no more. It was a small shift, barely noticed outside that one county, but it rippled outward. Other veterans in other towns heard the story and began organizing their own defense committees. The NAACP grew bolder in its legal challenges. The movement that would eventually force the nation to confront its original sin of racism gained momentum. One small act of resistance at a time, one stand against terror after another. Decades later, when the civil rights movement entered its most visible phase, when buses were integrated and lunch counters desegregated and voting rights won through blood and sacrifice, the veterans of Clarksville were old men. Grandfathers who sat on porches and watched the world change in ways they had once thought impossible. They rarely told their story. No monuments were erected, no history books recorded their names. They had defended their community because it was necessary, because they had skills and training and a belief that their service should mean something. They had stood against terrorism when the law refused to, had risked everything to protect their families, had proven that black men could and would fight for dignity and rights and peace. James Richter died in 1983 on a winter morning much like the one when he had first returned from war. His funeral was attended by dozens of veterans, old men in worn suits who saluted his coffin and remembered a time when they had been young and strong and had done something extraordinary. Thomas Pruitt spoke at the service, his voice thin but steady, talking about courage and sacrifice and the quiet heroism of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice. He said that Richter had been a soldier twice, once overseas and once at home, and that both battles had mattered, both had been necessary. Both had been won even when the cost was high. The story lives now in whispers and memories and oral histories collected by scholars, in archives where records gather dust. It is a chapter of American history that makes people uncomfortable, a reminder that the greatest generation returned to a country that did not want them as equals, that terrorism was not limited to foreign enemies, that the fight for freedom did not end at the water's edge. But it is also a story of resistance, of dignity, of men who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to stand for something better. That night in March 1946, when armed black veterans faced down the Ku Klux Klan, they did not end racism or defeat hatred. But they prove that terror only works when victims accept their victimization, that courage can exist in the face of overwhelming odds, that men who have defended democracy abroad will not meekly surrender it at home. They wrote a small chapter in the long, ongoing struggle for justice, a chapter that reminds us that freedom is never given but must be defended, that rights mean nothing without the will to claim them, that sometimes the greatest battles are fought on quiet streets in small towns by men whose names history forgets, but whose actions echo forward, shaping the world we inherit. The cross burnings continued for years afterward, but never again in the colored section of Clarksville. The Klan rode, but they rode elsewhere, seeking softer targets, remembering what happened when they faced men who refused to be afraid. And in the houses of that small community, rifles were cleaned and oiled and kept ready, passed down from fathers to sons with stories about a time when black veterans took on the Klan and won, when ordinary men did something extraordinary, when the impossible became real, if only for one night, if only for one stand, if only to prove that it could be done.